So I've been thinking about this for a while now. I knew the day was coming. I just didn't think it was going to come this fast. But I quit setting up and tearing down my equipment every night because I bought an observatory. All right, so I think it goes without saying I purchased this with my own money. Nexdome has not sponsored this or offered me anything in return for this review. Kind of on the fence about doing it because I had a lot of issues getting it to the point where it's at now, but I do want to say that now that I've gotten over all the hurdles, I absolutely love this thing. It's everything that I wanted it to be. It just took a lot longer to get there than I expected. So this review is going to be the good, the bad, and the ugly. As cliche as that sounds, it's really a good fit for how I want to structure this video. So we'll start with the good right now, show it off a little bit, show you what it can do, and then we'll move into the issues that I had getting it to this point. First, we'll just talk a little bit about the observatory itself. One of the reasons that I bought it, besides, like I said, it just looks really cool. It looks like one of the big observatories you'd see sitting up on a mountain, but it has an unobstructed view of zenith. So we can pop in here real quick just to show you I've got the shutter fully open now. And like I said, there's no obstruction if I need to shoot up right to the zenith. So that was important to me. That shutter opens up 104 degrees. The actual material that the observatory is made from is ABS, and it is coated with something called solar coat that offers supposedly really good UV protection. So inside diameter of this, the 86-inch diameter circle, so that gives me 7 feet 2 inches on the inside, plenty of room to move around in. And then it's also 7 feet 6 inches tall to the top center of the dome. So I'm a short guy. I'm about 5'8", and I have no problem standing up and walking around, even being close to the edge without hitting my head on anything. Nexdome also claims that this can facilitate up to a 14-inch SCT. I obviously have my 8-inch in here right now. And as far as a refractor is concerned, it can fit a refractor up to a 1400 millimeter length. So take you guys in, give you a little dog and pony show here. In addition to buying the observatory, I bought the automation kit for the shutter as well as the automation kit for rotating the dome, both of which have manual switches, so I can rotate this either way, clockwise or counterclockwise. And then the same thing up here with the shutter motor. I can use the switch and open and close it manually if I need to. It is also ASCOM compliant, so I'll show you my scope here. So riding up on top, I have all my equipment, including a mini PC. This is the Melee 3. This computer runs my acquisition software, which is Nina. ASCOM drivers for the EQ6R. Also drivers for my camera. Right now, my guide camera, OAG, are mounted, but you can see I don't have my imaging camera on because it is currently up front riding on the Hyperstar. So the same PC controls the dome, both for rotation and for the shutter. So I have the ASCOM drivers installed in here as well. If we come over to the PC, this is the Beaver Dome software. So this is what actually controls both the shutter and the rotation. Come into our setup button here, and we have additional options that we can do. Here's our configuration. So we can do things in here like speed up how fast the dome rotates, can speed up how fast the shutter opens and closes. This is where you do your initial setup for everything. I'm using Nina, like I said before. So right now I have the dome connected to Nina. So I have control right within Nina, both manually and through my sequence. So right now the shutter is open. If I click close, the shutter will close. And as it comes down, you can see there is a limit switch right here on the corner. Once it hits it, that stops the motor from going any further. And then the opposite direction, if I was to open it, obviously it'll open the shutter for us. And there is a second limit switch right next to the motor that once it hits, it stops the shutter from going any further. Rotation works the same way, except you can specify where you want to slew, how far you want to rotate. I'm not going to do 180 now because that's really high, but I can say go 10 degrees counterclockwise, and it's going to rotate. I'll hit it one more time for you guys so you can see it. So it's 10 degrees at a time. So I can specify how much I want to rotate this thing around. So as well as the manual controls within Nina, I also can program this right into my advanced sequencer, so you can see where it's opening the shutter at the beginning of my session. The configuration, if we jump back over into equipment and go down to my dome, you can tell it to synchronize, so the dome follows the telescope. I leave this off because it all works within my sequence, which having this configured within the advanced sequencer allows me to completely automate any of my sessions. Since I'm already polar aligned and I'm not tearing down obviously every night and setting back up, my polar alignment will stay good for a while. I check it every few days just to make sure, but so far it's been pretty rock solid. So literally right now, if it was clear tonight, and it's not going to be, but I would be able to tell Nina just completely drive everything for me. Open up the shutter, cool the camera just like always. It'll follow the scope. As soon as the scope starts to slew around, this shutter opening will follow it, and it'll follow it throughout the night. So I usually start my sessions off with pointing over to the west about 70 degrees up. As the scope slews over, this entire dome rotate and follow the scope as well. The other thing that I purchased was a rain sensor, and this was just like a safety net for me. And if I'm gonna shoot, because maybe it's clear for a couple hours, I'm not going to bed and leaving it by itself. This is just in case a random rain cloud shows up. As soon as water hits this, that shutter will automatically close, and it'll automatically close without anything being turned on as far as my mini PC. That rain sensor is actually connected right here. So this is the motor with controller board for the dome rotation. It talks wirelessly to the motor and controller board that's up in the shutter controller. So rain sensor detects water, sends a signal to this unit will shoot it over wirelessly to this unit, and that shutter will close automatically. I also bought the ventilation system. So there's an exhaust fan right there, which is controlled right here. You can program it for specific temperatures and humidity levels to turn the fan on and off. There's the temperature probe right there. I just have it kind of hanging. That's been working relatively well. It seems to help a little. I think it needs a bigger fan, but I have no way of really testing that. Like I said, that's the good. I absolutely love this thing. I don't want to get the impression like I'm not happy with it. I am very happy with it right now. The issues was this should have been a weekend project for us, maybe a little bit longer, and it wasn't. It ended up being like a month and a half, not because it actually took that long, but I had to wait for things like weather to clear up. I had to wait for Nexdome to send me new parts for things that weren't correct. So a lot of delays, but once we got through everything, like I said, it's an awesome unit. But that brings us to the next part of the video, the bad. So all excited about using this thing. The very first day, very first step, I had a friend come over on the weekend. It was a perfect weekend for this because it was mid-70s, sun was out, so we weren't going to be sweating our butts off doing this thing. And step one, per the documentation, per the instructions, is to assemble these bays. So I have one bay on each side. They are accessories. They don't come with the observatory, so I paid extra for them. And these holes just didn't line up. I mean, most of them would, but when you get to the final one, there was just no way to get the screw through. The holes themselves are the same diameter as the screws that they are meant to take. So we took this thing apart probably 3 times and put it back together thinking we were doing something wrong. But in the end, because this was our final screw and I had to go through this top piece, the side piece, and the back piece, you couldn't even see through the holes. So I just ran my drill through to finish it off. Same thing on the other bay on the other side. So we got that together. The other problem was, as soon as we started, the screws that were to be used to assemble this with, I didn't have. So we couldn't even start. So now we have to stop, run to the hardware store, and get the screws that we needed. Luckily, we thought, hey, before we do that, let's go and go through all the documentation, because they're all separate PDFs depending on what phase of the installation you're in. And we discovered that we were missing another bag of screws for another part of the assembly, for putting the wheels on underneath the dome itself. So before we even could get started on putting anything together, we had to run up to Home Depot and get the screws that we needed, because I didn't want to wait. I'm sure they would have sent them to me, but I didn't want to wait what would probably be another week. I'm in Northeast Ohio in the States. They're in British Columbia, I believe, up in Canada. So, you know, it's not going to get here overnight, and I didn't want to wait. Funny enough, that's why I have this bag sitting here, even though I was missing screws, that's what I have left over. So it's like they were just, I don't know, grabbing handfuls of washers and screws and everything and just hoping for the best. I don't know. I have a lot left over, but none of those were what I actually needed for the bays or for the wheels. Also, on the back piece, when we were putting it together, I had to trim the ABS a little bit. It was like left over from manufacturing, but it was keeping us from even getting this thing close to being put together. So, I mean, I suppose kind of minor things, but this was the start of it. Step 2 was to actually put together the walls and attach them to the bays, as well as the door frame. So same type of thing for these flanges. Wasn't as difficult as the bays were, but some of these holes, you can see how they overlap here, but some of these holes, again, just didn't line up. So we had to run the drill through on some of them just to get the screws into place. So once we had the bays in place, we had the walls in place, and came in, and you have to make sure that these walls all the way around are in a 86-inch diameter circle. So what Nexdome suggests that you do is whatever you're setting this on is to draw an 86-inch diameter circle all the way around. In my case, it would be the concrete pad, right? And then line up the walls as you're trying to fasten them to the floors. That was not working out for me. Not saying it was a wrong way of doing it, but everything just moves around. So what I ended up doing was in the center, underneath my cable management here, I drilled a hole dead center of my compass and then took a piece of conduit and cut that conduit 45 inches. And then from one end of that conduit, I measured 2 inches in and drilled the same size hole into it, slipped an Allen key through the conduit into the hole in the concrete, and that gave me a measuring stick of 43 inches from the center of the compass to the edge of the wall. So I would go around and I would check that post, that wall, and that post, and then I put my tap cons in to secure it to the concrete. And then I made my way around and did the same thing for each post that I came by. Made sure the 2 posts for each wall were lined up, checked the center, and then put the tap cons in. And once I did that, I'm like, okay, let's slip the shelves into here. This shelf that you see that I have in, I actually made that because the shelves they sent us, and I'll show you a picture here, they just don't fit in. The documentation and support when I talked to them about it said, you gotta spread these columns out on both sides to get the shelf in. And again, that just wasn't happening. I did get it in, but I had to take my fist and pound on the corner multiple times just to get it to where it looked level. And then at that point, I had huge gaps running along the side here. When I asked them about that, they told me those gaps were by design so you can get your wiring down below your desk, which, sorry, to me, that's laughable. These things don't fit. Even on their own forums, you can see where people are talking about the shelves don't fit. And as far as I can tell, most people don't even use them. They do something like I did. They either make something or they'll buy a shelving unit to put in there in its place. Over here, I put a toolbox, which was my intent anyways, to keep everything in here that I would need for any sessions. So we'll make our way back out here and we'll talk about this door. So the first problem with the door is the actual door opening itself is larger than the door. And the way they take care of that is they provide you with this gasket. So now the door hits the gasket. The problem with this is there was nothing inside of here, completely hollow and flat. So I ended up putting a piece of tubing inside to expand it out to get a better seal because water would get in. I mean, you could see the gap. And then on the door side of things, I put a small strip of, I think this is for a car door seal around there. So now when I close it, I've got a pretty decent seal going on. But the other issue with the door is it's very flimsy. It's not as thick as the walls, and you can tell at night. I have LED strips that I put around on the inside here just so I have some light if I'm in there working. But if I turn those on and close the door, you can see the light shining right through. This is thin. You can see how flimsy this is, right? So, you know, that I need to shore that up still because I just don't like how that is. You can see the door jam's actually moving when I'm moving the door. The other problem, and I'm going to sneak back inside, is this latch is actually supposed to come in front of this column, and that's how the door is supposed to close. And you know, not even close. When I brought that up to them, they told me, well, you should have just put washers in here and brought the whole locking mechanism forward. And I asked them, okay, well, where is that in the documentation? Because they told me that because I told them that I cut a slot in the side of the post to take this latch. So now it closes. Once I push on it, now it lines up and it closes, and I've got a pretty decent seal with everything else that I had to change on it. Also, be aware that inside, you'll see a loop that hangs down here. Couldn't find it. I think I tossed it already. But it's a device that's, I guess, intended to use to lock this thing from the inside so nobody can get in. But if it swings into the lock position, you're not getting in either. So I took that piece out. I don't need that happening. I'd also hit this with some silicone spray because there was one time during assembly that I couldn't get it open. It was stuck. You could see this lever rides up against the door, actually leaving scratches on it. Not a big deal, but again, it's just something fit and finish type stuff. So I'd recommend that you hit this with some silicone spray or WD-40. I had to jump through the shutter to get in here. Luckily, I was able to open it up to do that and spray it down, and then I was able to open the door again. So the same type of issues when I was putting the dome, the part on top of the walls here that spins around. There are 6 panels, 3 on each side, as well as assembling the shutter that goes in the middle. So 3 on the right side, 3 on the left side. Again, they overlap and screw into place. Some of the holes had to be drilled out. If we take a walk to the back here, you can see the shutters ride in that plastic rail all the way across the top down to the other side, and it's the same thing on the opposite side. This one, you can see the wheel is almost out of this track. Sometimes when this shutter comes down, because this back part of the shutter actually just slides down with gravity, sometimes this wheel will actually fall out of this track, and then when I try to open it up, it obviously causes issues. So currently I'm 3D printing a small piece of this track and gonna try and fit it in there to take care of that. So the other thing that I wanted to show you, and I'm going to close the shutter before doing so it's easier to see. So with the shutter closed, that top part of the shutter, right? So this front part of the shutter slides into the top part and the whole thing slides back to the rear of the unit when it's fully open. There's an issue when it's closed like this. You can see this bracket right here. This came with the dome. This was on the shutter. Without this bracket here, this can actually roll forward and then the top of your dome is open. So they put a bracket here. I put this in. This is just a piece of aluminum that I bent. I drilled a hole in the top to fasten it in place because what they gave me was this right here. This is a stop block. The idea was to slide it in. You can see the gap between the panels. This was their solution to hit this bracket and stop the shutter from opening up. You can see it didn't last a day. And this is just when we were manually opening and closing the shutter. It snapped and fell right off. I don't think there's anybody that owns this observatory that is still using this thing. Everybody threw it away and did the same thing that I did. Put some kind of a bracket there that is a lot sturdier and serves the purpose the way it's meant to be served. I pulled this out of the bag and I laughed, I'm sorry. One of the other things I had no luck with were these retention guides. The idea behind these was, again, you'd pull the bolt off of one of the wheels and that's how it would mount. Use a self-tapping screw on the bottom of it, and then these things would just ride. See if I can show you. Would just ride on the top of the track like this, right? So the idea behind it, I'm assuming, is it helps keep the dome in place in case of high winds. Now, I don't think the dome's gonna go anywhere, but a little extra assurance. I'm like, I was kind of happy to see this. The problem is they don't stay in track. There's 3 of them. The directions don't tell you where to put them. You've only got so many choices, right? They've got to go on the post someplace. So we have 6 posts. I tried them in numerous places. You can see where I have holes or a screw. I tried putting them in a triangle. I could never get all 3. One would maybe stay on all the time, but the other 2 would always just jump out. And again, there's people online that I saw had the same issue, and they just don't use them. So causing me more grief than it was helping, so I took them off and I'm not even using them. So, if you're a visual guy and you're just looking for something, you're gonna be sitting in there, you don't need to do what I'm gonna go through with you next, and that's the automation piece of everything. You're gonna be inside looking through the scope anyways. You can manually open up the shutter. You can manually rotate the dome as whatever you're watching is moving through the sky. But I wanted a fully automated solution, so I'm gonna go over the issues that we had with that. So the first issue that I had was, you can see the screw that holds this gear onto the motor for rotation. It's supposed to be a set screw. I didn't get the set screw. And again, I didn't want to wait for it, so dug through my random box of screws, found something that was the same thread size and put it in. Not a big deal, but again, everything adds up for me. I installed the track. Holes are already pre-drilled, so all the way around we have a track, and that track is what that gear bites into. So as this thing rotates, the square teeth on the gear drop into the square holes on the track, and that's how we have our rotation. The problem I had with it is it would either jump out of this track or it actually gets stuck, and the motor would just start making a god-awful noise because it couldn't rotate anymore. So reached out to Nexdome, and understandably they said, hey, you have to make sure that your walls are a perfect circle, 86 inches diameter. And like I showed you guys, I already did that, and I informed them of it. I sent them pictures showing them how I did it, as well as some videos for a lot of the issues that I was having, just so they could possibly find the solution and what's going on. What ended up being the problem, so like I said, the holes were pre-drilled for the track. And as I was looking down over the top edge of this track, it seemed like there were some high spots, like it was going up like this and then back down. Not that pronounced, but it just looked like there were some high spots. So in the instruction manuals, they said holes are pre-drilled. But if the holes aren't there, here's where you measure the distance from this lip to the top of the track. And they said that because this is a new track system, both for rotation and for the shutter. These are brand new systems. People had problems with the previous version. I saw they redesigned everything, so I thought we'd be good to go. So the part of the directions where they said if you don't have holes, 20 millimeters from this edge to the top edge, is because I'm assuming they probably had old stock for the old track system. Their old track system was a rubber track that was just double-sided tape and stuck to the inside of the dome. So I went and on my 3D printer, I printed a 20 millimeter square block, and I rested it right on the top of the track, and it fit right into this edge. And then I started walking around with it, and it would stay in, and then it would get to a point where it was jumping up too high. So I would stop, I would back out the screw, push the track down with my little jig that I made, re-drill the hole just to open it up a little bit more, and then put the screw back in. I did that all the way around. And when I got done, I came back and went all the way around with that block and made sure that it was riding on both of those edges all the way around. So now I knew that I had this track nice and straight. That took care of probably 85–90% of my issues, I guess. It was rotating pretty consistently. Every once in a while, it would still jump out of track, but it was just backing out of the track. So there was two things that I had to do for that. The first one was you can see I have washers behind the mounts here. I needed to pull this whole assembly out about 3/8 of an inch probably, just so the teeth didn't dig so deep into these square grooves. The second thing I had to do was on these two screws here on the track for the shutter opening. See if I can get in there and show you guys, but I actually put washers behind here just to bring this out a little bit more because it was actually pushing in and taking away from the roundness of the track itself. So after doing that, this thing rotated consistently. It was no longer jumping out of the track. It was no longer getting stuck. So now it was time to move into installing the shutter assembly. And full disclosure, all the issues that I had up until this point, I let them know quite a few times how frustrated I was, how I felt that with the money that I spent, that it is just unacceptable to have as many issues as I was having with this thing. I would tell them that, hey, this is crazy. Why are these things not working? And they would tell me things, especially with my rotation problems. They would repeat themselves. Hey, you got to make sure you're on a perfect circle. I get it. You can tell me that one time. I proved to you that it is 86 inches on diameter all the way around. Stop saying it over and over again. That's not the issue. And then they would proceed to tell me that nobody else is having problems. That to me was laughable because unless they just use their internet connection to take orders for these things, they know there's problems out there. Even on their own forums, there's people talking about these issues. The problem is a lot of people that buy these things, they just accept it and they fix it themselves. I'm not that guy. I spent a lot of money on something. I expect it to be what it's supposed to be. So that was the battle I was having with them, and I was letting them know more than once, like I said. So moving on to installing the shutter. What you see right here now is not completely from Nexdome, and I'll get into that in a minute. But my first issue was with this metal bracket right here. You see we have a sprocket here. We have a small sprocket coming out of the motor on the left-hand side over there. In between here, where I have these guides right now, there are additional gears with additional washers for spacers. So this whole thing, all the way along this assembly, was sitting in the geared setup. The issue I had was the bracket would not line up. I could get this bolted up. I could get that flange bolted up, but then these two bolts here, the one that's on the top of the guide and the one that's to the right, that actually holds, there's a track that the shutter slides through. So you gotta pull those out and replace them with two bolts here. Those did not line up. The other issue was, same thing with this gear, you replace the bolts, and I had to drill this hole out in the side of the dome and get a longer bolt, and you can see, and I wanna change this, but I've got a stack of washers in here just to get this thing lined up with the chain. I notified them about it, and they told me that nobody else was having problems with this. They didn't understand it. I told them there are plenty of people that have these problems online. They asked me for a link. I sent them to them. They went silent after that as far as that conversation was concerned. But they said, well, all these parts are CNC machines, so it's going to be the same thing that you have, but we'll send you out another one. And I'm like, well, what good's that going to do me? If you're telling me that they're all going to be the same, that's not going to help. And he's like, well, I don't know what else to do, so let's try that. So I said, fine. So he sent me a new set of rails, and they were identical, just like he said, to what I had. So at that point, I'm done messing around. I went up there, and those two bolts that didn't line up in the bracket, I took the bracket down, took it into my garage, put it on my drill press, and I slotted the holes out longer than they were so I can get everything together. So I got that up. That chain, again, with the sprockets, these guides are a fix that I found online. I'll talk about that in a minute here. But got the rail up, got the chain all threaded up through all the way up to the motor, and then rinse and repeat on the right-hand side. Except this time, even though I had to do the same thing, I had to slot my holes and make adjustments, the chain was too short. So back to the email, told them that the chain was too short, and they sent me new chains. Literally just the chains. You can see that the chain is attached to this chain bracket here that I had to bolt to the shutter, right? That came as one assembly. They just sent me the chain. Open-ended chain with the master links and some wire to actually attach it to my existing chain bracket. I emailed them back and said, I don't have the tools to crimp that wire down properly. Can't you just send me the whole assembly? So that's what they were gonna do. And again, I was expressing how unhappy I was with all these issues like this. So they said, yep, okay, no problem. We'll send you a whole chain assembly. And it was at this point that I started thinking, they're helping, they're trying to be helpful, but it kind of felt like smoke and mirrors. You're gonna send me the same parts that I already have. You have to know that people online are having these issues, yet you're just sending parts just, I guess, so you can say that you're trying to be helpful. Again, I wasn't a happy camper. I didn't slander them or their product. I just letting them know how upset I was. I spent a lot of money for this. So I figured, hey, while I'm waiting for my new chain assembly, I'll start preparing to get the power up to it. So you can see these silver strips inside the track. And again, this is the track that rotates the dome. These strips were not installed with the track. They were actually coiled up. You can hold them in the palm of your hand. You had to uncoil them, start at a break point because this track is in 4 pieces, pop this screw out and feed each one of these strips all the way around. And it was a challenge, but it wasn't too horrible. I got it done, obviously. Before I started, you can see the insulation, right? Top's negative, bottom's positive. They don't specifically state that in the documentation, but there's a picture in there that shows positive is on bottom, negative is on top. So when I picked the power block up and flipped it over, I saw that positive was on top, negative is on bottom. So now my polarity is reversed. So I had two options at that point. I could pull these all the way back out and put them where they're supposed to be because the instructions were wrong. The connectors on the back of this, I have them tucked up behind here so you can't see them. One is like a bullet type connector, and then the other one is a spade connector, so it wasn't like I can just easily reverse the connections. Or possibly I could rewire the block, but the wires are so tight in here, there's just no room for that to happen. So I ended up cutting the connectors off of the wires that come off of the strip and swapping them up there, resoldering them back together, and so I could feed power that way. So they look backwards, but they're actually correct. But that brings me to this power block. Let's come over here on the table here. So the power block itself is nothing but a piece of plastic. I don't know what type of plastic it is, but these hooks are just threaded hooks, like the threaded hooks that you would buy at a hardware store, you know, to screw into your house soffit and hang plants from or something. You know, I don't know if they're screwed in here or if they heat set them in there, and then they soldered wires to them. So this was the first block that I got. You can see the negative wire was cut, but I didn't notice it at first because of the way it was sitting in here. It looked like one piece, something like that. But this ring terminal was not soldered to this hook. So I tried soldering it myself. I got it on there, but you can see the plastic's all melted and burnt and everything. But so I sent them an email when I noticed the wire was cut. So they said no problem, and they sent me another one. This one, again, I soldered it. None of the connectors were soldered on it. The wires were a larger gauge this time for whatever reason. There was no soldering done to the hook. So I emailed them and asked them about that, and they said they have discovered that they can't solder two different types of materials together. I mean, all of a sudden, I guess. I don't know. So again, I tried soldering it myself to put it together and at least try to get the power ready for when my replacement chain assembly comes. Just to show you guys, so their whole idea is this bracket here. I'm trying to do this all with one hand. So you take the bolt out for the wheel, and it uses that bolt, and then you put another screw into the column itself on the bottom of the bracket to hold it into place, and then this top hole is what holds this power block and those hooks right in those slots up against those metal strips that I installed. That just is a horrible design, I'm sorry. This thing was jumping out and I'm losing power to the shutter depending where it would land. It was just a mess. They did send me another one when I did get my chains. So this is the third one they sent me, and the only difference was now for whatever reason they put a cover on it, and when I opened it up, again, we're not soldered on any of these 4 wires. The connections are made just because the wires are so short and they pull tension between the hooks. So that's just not a good electrical connection. I did try to use it again thinking maybe it was just lined up better for the tracks, but I had another issue. The actual power input port over on the side here, there was a solder bridge on the inside, so it was shorted out. So I had to heat that up and break the solder bridge to get that to work. I gave up on it, and I have this solution here. Again, we'll talk about that when I talk about the guides that I have up top here that I did for the chain assembly. So I knew I was going to do this, so I put that to the side for now. And I said, okay, well, while I'm waiting for my chains, I'm going to take this chain rail off and my chains, get everything taken down and ready for the new stuff when it gets here. As I did that, this shaft right here pulled right out of the side of the motor housing. I'm like, unbelievable. So I sent them an email and told them what happened, and I said, you know, at this point, this is just laughable. I'm really regretting the purchase that I made. This motor shaft just fell out of the side of the motor. You know, I don't understand what's going on. What do we do now? And about 10 minutes later, I got an email from PayPal saying that I had a $1,250 refund issued from Nexdome. They didn't tell me they were doing this. At first I was happy, but then I was like, he didn't tell me he was doing this, so what's going on? A few minutes later, he sent me an email saying that I just refunded you for the shutter unit, and I guess that resolves your issues since the unit was not satisfactory and our support is not sufficient for you. So I replied back to him and said, hey, thanks for the refund, but what are we gonna do about this motor shaft falling out of the motor? And he responded back with, that's why I gave you a refund, so I don't have to support you anymore. So I was left stuck at this point with figuring out what happened and just trying to get this whole automation system running for the shutter. So the first thing I needed to do was to get the cover off the motor, but I don't know if you guys can see it. There's 4 screws in each corner and they were all stripped right from the factory. So I ended up pulling the whole motor assembly down and taking it into the garage to see what happened. So luckily that motor shaft that slid out actually goes into a coupler on the inside, and the other side of that coupler attaches to the motor itself. So easy fix. It was just the grub screws weren't tight enough and that shaft just slid out. So I got that fixed, but you know, I found a Facebook group called We Love Our Nexdome Observatories. It wasn't ran by Nexdome, it's an actual private group with other owners of this unit, and I actually got more helpful advice from those guys than I did from Nexdome themselves. So I told them what happened, and they said, hey, while you're in there taking a look at that, make sure your limit switches aren't wired backwards. That's these switches here, right? This is the one, so when it's open, it stops, and then like I showed you guys before, this is the one that hits when it's closed. And in fact, when I opened that up and I looked at the controller board, those switches were wired backwards. So they saved me some time of having to pull this thing back down after I would realize that those switches were working backwards, so had to fix that as well. So back to power. The way this works, you can see the power cable's in the back of the unit. It comes down and it actually connects over here where I was showing you guys the negative and the positive strips that I put in. This strip gets power with that power block we were talking about, but I 3D printed this, and this replaces those threaded hooks that I was showing you. There's actual bearings inside each one of these 4 connectors. Power comes up in here, it's wired up inside, and those bearings ride on the metal strip, providing the 24 volts around the dome, so it's a slip ring type of connection, and that's how the power goes up the cable and into the shutter. The same gentleman that I found on that Facebook group that designed this was not my design. I just printed his files out and bought the parts that I needed. It was the same guy that designed these guides. So instead of having sprockets, we've just got chain guides. And just like the power block, as soon as I put these on, everything worked. I had to make my adjustments still on the bracket, like I said. I had to space out the sprocket down here, but there's nothing for it to jump out of. There was no need for all those sprockets to be all the way along this arch. These guides were all that we needed. So I've had 0 problems with it. I've had 0 problems with the power distribution block that he came up with. I'll leave links in the description over to the STLs. You know, if you have one of these units or thinking about buying it, I wouldn't even bother with what they give you for power and for the chains. So like I said at the beginning of the video, I really love this thing. I have no complaints now that I got through all of those hurdles. Was on the fence about doing this review. This review was supposed to be a build/review. I mean, I even had the world's largest unboxing set and filmed and ready to go for this thing, but I was just having so many issues along the way that I couldn't focus on 2 things at once. It's just how I am. But again, now that it's together and everything's working, I'm extremely happy with it. It's just, if you decide to buy one of these things, don't expect it to be an out-of-the-box solution, especially for the automation stuff. If you, like I said before, if you're just using it for visual, then you're probably going to be okay. Shelves aren't going to fit. You have to drill out some holes. Maybe not a big deal, but again, when I spend a lot of money, I expect things to be correct. You know, so I guess the big question is, some of you may have, possibly, I don't know, is would I recommend it? That's a real tough one to answer. I think the only way that I would tell somebody yes is if you're a DIY type of person. If you can figure things out and take things apart, put things together, redesign stuff, you know, really good with working with your hands and issues and stuff, then you know what to expect. And yeah, go ahead and get it, because by the time you get it to this point, it like I said, it's cool. It does what it's supposed to do. If you're not that type of person, no, stay away from it. It's not worth it. It's expensive, even though it's a budget observatory. I get it. Our next option up is probably sitting around 20,000 someplace. So this really is a budget observatory, but still, for the kind of money that we're spending, it's, you know, that's still a nice chunk of change. So hopefully this helps anybody that's looking at buying this to make a decision on whether or not you want to go forward. Check out Cloudy Nights, check out the Nexdome group on Facebook, see what others are saying and what they're doing. Just trying to help you make a decision, right? Just like any review that I do, I want to be honest about it. Like I said, this was the good, the bad, the ugly. So hope you guys find this helpful. As always, I want to say thank you to all my members, both here on YouTube and on buymeacoffee.com. I'll see you in the next video, and clear skies.